"You are fired," shouted a millionaire when he saw his cook feeding a little beggar girl in his kitchen. Days later, a limousine stopped in front of his mansion, and he fainted when he found out who the girl was. The rain punished the mansion's gardens with relentless fury. Lightning cut through the dark sky like silver spears, while the wind howled among the century-old trees surrounding the property. In the spacious and impeccably equipped kitchen, Nancy worked with the precision of someone who knew every inch of that environment. At 45, her brown face showed expression marks that revealed both smiles and concerns accumulated during the 15 years dedicated to Richard's family. Her black hair, always tied in a disciplined bun, matched the impeccable uniform she wore. While cutting vegetables for dinner, her deep brown eyes, like pools of warm water, occasionally turned to the window, observing the intensifying storm. The aroma of spices that Nancy always added to her dishes filled the air, a personal touch that her boss, despite his coldness, secretly appreciated. The soup simmered slowly on the stove, and the fillet that would be served to her employer was already marinated and ready to be grilled at the perfect moment. "My God, what a storm!" Nancy muttered to herself, adjusting the soup's seasoning. "I hope to finish before he arrives, or I'll have to hear more complaints." Nancy knew her employer's temperament well. Richard, a 60-year-old businessman, had built his real estate empire with an iron fist and an unwavering determination that many mistook for coldness. Tall, with an imposing bearing, impeccably combed grey hair, and a penetrating gaze, he rarely showed any sign of kindness. Since becoming a widower 5 years earlier, Richard had become even more reclusive and bitter, as if grief had crystallized all his worst characteristics. He lived alone in the enormous mansion, surrounded by luxury but empty of affection. Nancy was one of the few people who could navigate her boss's stormy moods without sinking, a skill developed over years of service. She knew exactly how to prepare meals, when to speak and when to remain silent, and especially how to make dishes that pleased the businessman's demanding palate. Men like him forget they were once children too, Nancy thought as she seasoned the sauce. Perhaps that's the reason for such hardness in the heart. The wall clock indicated it was 15 minutes to 8, when an unusual noise captured Nancy's attention, something between a moan and a sob, almost inaudible under the roar of the storm. She stopped what she was doing, sharpening her ears. In that immense house, with its labyrinthine corridors and empty rooms, it wasn't uncommon for the wind to create strange sounds when penetrating through invisible cracks. However, this sound had something different, something human. Nancy wiped her hands on her white apron and walked slowly to the back door that led to the gardens, firmly holding the kitchen knife she used to cut vegetables. Her heart beat rapidly in her chest. There were no other employees in the house at that hour, which made the sound even more inexplicable. "Who's there?" Nancy asked, with a firm voice despite the nervousness she felt. "If someone is playing around, know that it's not funny at all." The silence that followed was broken only by the drumming of rain on the windows and the bubbling of soup on the stove. Nancy was about to return to her work when the sound repeated, this time more distinct, coming directly from the other side of the door. With a courage she didn't know she possessed, Nancy turned the knob and opened the door. A gust of freezing wind and rain invaded the kitchen, but what really froze Nancy was the sight before her. A small, drenched figure, trembling violently, hugging herself in a futile effort to find warmth. It was a girl with large, frightened eyes that reflected fear and helplessness. Her simple dress was completely soaked, clinging to her thin body, and her black hair was stuck to her pale face. Upon seeing Nancy, the little one took a step back like a cornered animal. "Please," whispered the girl with trembling lips turned purple from cold. "I just want a place to hide from the rain. I got lost and don't know how to get home." Nancy didn't hesitate for a second. Completely forgetting the dinner she was preparing and the possible consequences of her actions, she extended her hand to the little one and gently pulled her into the warm kitchen. She quickly closed the door, blocking the fury of the storm, and guided the trembling girl to a chair near the stove. The child was soaked with purple lips and teeth chattering from cold. Nancy hurried to find a clean towel and wrapped it around the child's shoulders, gently rubbing to restore circulation. While working to warm the little visitor, Nancy observed her carefully. She didn't seem like a common street child. Her delicate features and manner of speaking suggested a good education, despite the deplorable conditions she was in. "What's your name, little one?" Nancy asked softly, serving a mug of hot chocolate she had prepared earlier for herself. "Don't be afraid, I'm here to help." Between sobs and shivers, the girl managed to articulate her name, Zoe. She was only 8 years old and explained that she had gotten lost during a school trip to the museum when she became distracted watching a rare bird in the garden. When she realized the school bus had left without her. Without money and not knowing how to get home, the girl wandered the streets for days, trying to find help, but people ignored her or pushed her away, frightened by her appearance, increasingly deteriorated by hunger and cold. During the storm, she saw the kitchen light through the garden bushes and, desperate, risked asking for help. "I'm so hungry," Zoe confessed in a weak voice, looking timidly at the soup simmering on the stove. "It's been so long since I've eaten anything besides a piece of bread I found." Nancy's maternal heart broke hearing this. Without thinking twice, she took a bowl and served a generous portion of the steaming soup, placing it before the girl, along with a piece of fresh bread she had baked that morning. She watched with a mixture of pain and relief as Zoe ate eagerly, stopping only to breathe between spoonfuls. The cook realized that beneath the dirt and exhaustion, Zoe was a pretty girl, with expressive eyes and a shy smile that occasionally appeared between bites. While eating, the little one began to open up more, sharing fragments of her life and answering Nancy's gentle questions. "My favorite book is The Girl of the Stars," commented Zoe when Nancy asked about school. "The teacher always lets me read it during recess when the other children go out to play." Nancy couldn't hide her surprise. "That's my favorite book too since I was little. My mother used to read it to me every night before bed." The conversation flowed naturally as Zoe finished her meal. Nancy noticed that the girl wore a colorful handmade bracelet made of beads and braided threads. Curiously, it was almost identical to one that Nancy kept as a memento from her homeland. When she mentioned this coincidence, Zoe's eyes lit up with a special glow, as if that small connection was a sign that she was finally safe. Nancy promised to help her get home as soon as the storm subsided a bit, and in the meantime ensured that the little one would be properly fed. "I'll take care of you until we find your parents," Nancy assured, stroking the girl's damp hair. "No one will harm you while you're with me." It was at that exact moment that the kitchen door opened violently. Richard entered like a storm, as imposing as the tempest roaring outside. His expensive suit was impeccable, protected by an umbrella he now shook to remove the water drops. His face was already contorted with irritation, even before seeing the unusual scene in his kitchen. Dinner clearly delayed, and his cook sitting at the table with an unknown, ragged child. For a moment he was paralyzed with surprise, his eyes alternating between Nancy, Zoe, and the table with the food that should have been served to him. When he finally managed to speak, his voice was low and dangerous, laden with a contained fury that Nancy knew all too well. "What is the meaning of this?" he asked, each word laden with ice. "Who authorized the entry of this beggar into my house?" Nancy rose quickly, protectively placing herself in front of Zoe, who shrank in fear. "Mr. Richard, this is Zoe. She got lost during a school trip and was in the rain, dying of cold and hunger. You just decided to turn my kitchen into a shelter for beggars without my permission," Richard interrupted, his voice increasing with each word. "You're delaying my dinner to feed a vagrant who is probably lying to get food." Zoe's eyes filled with tears upon hearing the cruel words, and she shrank even more in her chair. Nancy, however, stood firm, years of submission giving way to a courage fueled by indignation. "She's just a child, sir. She's lost and scared. We can't simply throw her back into the storm." Richard's face turned red with anger. He slammed his fist on the table so hard that the empty soup bowl jumped. "I can and I will. This is my house and you are here to serve me, not to collect any trash you find on the street." The words hung in the air like sharp blades. Nancy felt her blood boil in her veins, but maintained her composure for Zoe, who was now crying silently. "Mr. Richard, please just let me finish feeding her and help her find her way home. I promise that I won't." "You're fired," Richard bellowed, cutting off any argument Nancy might present. "How dare you bring a beggar into my home? Leave immediately, both of you. Get your things and disappear before I call the authorities." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Nancy felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. 15 years of loyal service ended in an instant over an act of compassion. She looked at Zoe, whose face was pale with fear, and at Richard, whose expression showed no sign of reconsideration. Swallowing the lump forming in her throat, Nancy nodded stiffly. "As you wish, sir. I'll get my things and leave as quickly as possible." Nancy guided Zoe out of the kitchen, feeling Richard's furious gaze burning into her back. As she gathered her few belongings in the small servants' room at the back of the house, she tried to stay calm so as not to frighten the girl even more. 15 years of life fit into a single suitcase, some clothes, photographs of family members, books, and small mementos she had accumulated. While packing, she noticed that Zoe was strangely quiet. The girl, who had previously been shivering from cold, was now burning with fever, her face red and her eyes glazed. "Zoe, are you okay?" asked Nancy, touching the child's forehead and immediately recoiling at the heat emanating from it. "My God, you're burning with fever." The girl merely nodded her head weakly, unable to respond. Her legs wobbled, and if not for Nancy's quick reflexes, she would have fallen to the floor. The situation had drastically complicated. Nancy was now unemployed, with a seriously ill child, and a violent storm blocked any possibility of immediate departure. To make matters worse, a deafening thunderclap announced that the storm was intensifying, transforming the streets into raging rivers. Through the window, Nancy could see tree branches being torn off by the force of the wind. "What am I going to do now?" Nancy whispered to herself, holding Zoe in her arms as the girl breathed with difficulty. "How am I going to get you out of here in this storm?" The question hung in the air unanswered, while the rain continued to fall mercilessly outside. Nancy was trapped in a nightmare, jobless, without immediate shelter, and with a sick child in her arms. The night was just beginning, and the worst was yet to come. The storm had diminished just enough for Nancy to leave Richard's mansion. With Zoe burning with fever in her arms, she faced flooded streets and cutting winds until reaching her modest apartment in the suburbs. The old building, with its peeling facade and creaking staircase, never seemed so welcoming as on that night. Nancy climbed the 4 flights of stairs with difficulty, feeling the weight of the girl and of emotional exhaustion. Her small apartment consisted of a living room that also served as a kitchen, a cramped bathroom, and a tiny bedroom, but it was clean and organized. The walls, decorated with some family photos and colorful crafts, gave a touch of warmth to the simple environment. Nancy placed Zoe in her bed, removed the girl's damp clothes, and dressed her in one of her own nightgowns, several times larger than necessary. While covering the little one with 2 blankets, she noticed that Zoe's skin alternated between violent chills and waves of intense heat, clear symptoms of a dangerous fever. Nancy moistened a cloth in cold water and placed it on the girl's forehead, watching with growing concern the unconscious moans escaping from the child's dry lips. "I'll take care of you, little one," whispered Nancy, stroking Zoe's damp hair. "Even if I have to stay up all night, I'll make sure you get better and find your family, I promise." The dawn advanced mercilessly, with Nancy alternating between preparing herbal teas to reduce the fever and changing the cold compresses on Zoe's forehead. Searching through her small medicine box, she found only a nearly empty bottle of children's pain reliever that she had bought months ago when her niece visited. It wouldn't be enough to combat what appeared to be a serious respiratory infection. Nancy checked her wallet. Only a few bills remained, the payment that Richard had given her the previous week. With determination, she put on her coat and went down to the 24-hour pharmacy on the corner, leaving Zoe asleep for a few minutes. The pharmacy, illuminated by pale fluorescent lights, was almost empty at that hour of the morning. The pharmacist listened attentively as Nancy described the girl's symptoms. He recommended antibiotics, antipyretics, and cough syrup, a set of medications that consumed almost all the money Nancy had. As she handed over the crumpled bills and counted the remaining coins, Nancy mentally calculated how long she could survive without a salary. The rent would be due in 2 weeks, and her savings were practically non-existent after years of supporting her sick mother alone, who had recently passed away. "These medicines are expensive, but I can't economize when it comes to a child's health," thought Nancy as she watched her last bills disappear into the cash drawer. Money comes and goes, but a life is irreplaceable. Back at the apartment, Nancy found Zoe agitated, tossing from side to side on the narrow bed, murmuring disconnected words. Gently, she managed to make the girls swallow the antibiotic and antipyretic, followed by a few spoonfuls of the cough syrup that seemed to be intensifying. The clock on the wall marked 4 in the morning when Nancy, exhausted, sat down beside the bed in an uncomfortable chair, determined to watch over the little one's sleep. Zoe's breathing was becoming more laborious with each hour, a worrying wheeze accompanying each inhalation. Nancy tried to stay calm but felt a growing fear at the evident signs that the girl's condition was rapidly worsening. In her feverish delirium, Zoe called for her mother, stretching her arms into emptiness as if she could touch her, and then sank back into the pillows, overcome by exhaustion. Nancy held her small, warm hand, trying to transmit security and comfort through that simple touch. Who could abandon such a sweet child? Nancy murmured to herself, wiping away a stubborn tear. If I had a daughter like you, Zoe, I would never leave you alone, not for a second. The first light of morning filtered through the thin curtains when Nancy woke with a start. Zoe was coughing violently, a deep, wet sound that indicated a pulmonary infection. Nancy rushed to the girl's side, helping her sit up to ease her breathing. Zoe's face was red and her cheeks burned to the touch. Her eyes, once bright and expressive, were glazed and distant, as if the girl were present only in body. Between coughing fits, Zoe tried to speak, but the words came out fragmented and confused, as if she were reliving memories or dreams. Nancy offered water, which Zoe drank eagerly before falling back onto the pillow, exhausted by the simple effort. While adjusting the blankets, Nancy noticed something shining under the sleeve of the girl's nightgown. Carefully, she pulled back the fabric and discovered a thin silver chain on Zoe's wrist with a small identification medal. Nancy's heart raced with the discovery. Perhaps there was the key to finding the girl's family. With trembling fingers, she examined the medal, but her hopes soon dissipated. The piece was severely damaged, probably due to the days Zoe had spent on the streets. The surface, once engraved, was scratched and partially erased, making it impossible to decipher any information beyond a few loose letters that didn't form any recognizable name. "This medal must be important," said Nancy, speaking more to herself than to Zoe, who remained immersed in fever. "Someone loved you enough to give you this gift. Someone must be desperately looking for you." The morning advanced slowly, with Zoe alternating between periods of feverish unconsciousness and brief moments of lucidity. During one of these intervals, Nancy managed to feed her a light broth and more medication, but the girl soon fell back asleep. The fever seemed to decrease for short periods, only to return with greater force, an emotional roller coaster that left Nancy increasingly worried. In her delirious moments, Zoe began to murmur words that captured Nancy's attention. Daddy politician, important speech, mommy singer, beautiful music. Nancy tried to ask questions, hoping to obtain more information that could help identify the girl's family, but Zoe oscillated between consciousness and unconsciousness, unable to maintain a coherent conversation. The loose and disconnected phrases didn't make much sense, and Nancy didn't know if they were real memories or merely products of the high fever. Still, she stored every word in the hope that they would eventually form a complete puzzle. Daddy politician, important, please find me, Zoe murmured between sobs, clinging to the blankets as if they were a person. Mommy, I'm scared. I want to go home. Miles away in an elegant mansion situated in an exclusive neighborhood, the atmosphere was one of absolute despair. The spacious room, decorated with expensive works of art and exquisite furniture, had been transformed into the operations center of a frantic search. Stephen, a 42-year-old man with strong features and penetrating eyes that usually conveyed confidence on political platforms, now revealed only anguish and exhaustion. His perfectly aligned suit, the trademark of the rising politician, was wrinkled after 2 sleepless nights. Beside him, Elizabeth, his 40-year-old wife, was crying silently on the leather sofa. Her once vibrant eyes were swollen and red from crying. In her trembling hands, she held a recent photograph of Zoe, taken during her last birthday. In the image, the girl smiled broadly, showing a missing front tooth and proudly holding a trophy from a school competition. The room was full of people, police officers coordinating the search, aides managing press communications, and close friends offering moral support. Maps of the city were spread across the coffee table, with areas marked and crossed out, representing locations already searched. "It's been days and nothing," said Stephen, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of despair. How does a child simply disappear during a school trip? There were teachers, monitors, museum guards. How did no one notice she was left behind? Elizabeth raised her eyes to her husband, her voice choked with tears. "You know our daughter, Stephen. Zoe always gets easily distracted when she sees something that fascinates her, that rare bird in the museum garden. She must have moved away just for a moment, and when she realized, everyone had left." The most experienced police officer, a robust man with graying hair, approached the couple with a grave expression. He held a tablet where security camera images played in sequence. The team had reviewed hours of footage, looking for any sign of the girl, but so far without success. The only images of Zoe were from inside the museum, walking with her classmates and then, briefly, heading to the garden. After that, she simply disappeared from the visual records as if she had been swallowed by the city. "We are mobilizing all available resources," assured the officer, his professional voice masking growing concern. "All patrols have Zoe's photo, and we are checking hospitals, shelters, and even areas affected by last night's storm." Back at the small apartment, Zoe's condition had worsened significantly. Her breathing was increasingly difficult, with alarming wheezes with each inhalation, and her face was unrecognizable due to swelling caused by persistent fever. Nancy, at the height of desperation, ran to the neighboring apartment and knocked frantically at the door. She knew that Martin, a retired doctor, lived there. After a few moments that seemed eternal, the door opened, revealing a white-haired gentleman with a sleepy expression, which quickly transformed into concern upon seeing Nancy's agitated state. "Martin, please, I need your help," Nancy pleaded, the words coming out in an anxious torrent. "There's a girl in my apartment. She's very sick with high fever and difficulty breathing. I don't have money to take her to a private hospital, and I'm afraid it's too serious to wait." Without hesitation, Martin grabbed his old medical bag and followed Nancy to her apartment. As he examined Zoe, his expression became increasingly serious. He listened to the girl's chest, checked her temperature, and examined her inflamed throat. When he finished, he stepped away from the bed and motioned for Nancy to follow him to the kitchen, where they could talk without disturbing the child. "Nancy, this girl has severe pneumonia," Martin explained in a low but firm voice. "The high fever, difficulty breathing, the sounds I'm hearing in her lungs, everything indicates an infection that has already developed considerably. She needs immediate hospitalization, intravenous antibiotics, and possibly supplemental oxygen." Nancy's heart seemed to freeze in her chest. She knew the situation was serious, but hearing the diagnosis confirmed by a doctor made everything much more real and frightening. "I'll take her to the hospital right now," she declared, already moving to gather what she would need for the trip. "Wait," said Martin, gently holding her arm. "Take her to Central Hospital. I know some doctors there. I can call ahead and explain the situation. It's your best chance of getting quick attention." Half an hour later, Nancy was sitting in the waiting room of the public hospital, Zoe unconscious in her arms. Despite Martin's call, the place was overwhelmed. Storm victims filled the corridors, along with the usual flow of patients. Doctors and nurses rushed back and forth, visibly overwhelmed. Nancy waited for almost 2 hours, watching Zoe's condition deteriorate by the minute, until she was finally called. A young doctor with deep, dark circles revealing several hours on duty examined Zoe quickly. Her diagnosis confirmed Martin's severe pneumonia, aggravated by exposure to harsh weather and possible malnutrition. However, what came next destroyed Nancy's hopes. "I'm sorry, but all our inpatient wards are completely full due to storm emergencies," explained the doctor, with genuine regret in her voice. "Besides, without the child's documents or proof that you're responsible for her, we cannot initiate prolonged treatment. Are you a relative of hers?" Nancy felt desperation growing like a wave inside her chest. "I'm not a relative, but I'm the only person she has now, please, doctor. She'll die if she doesn't receive treatment." The doctor seemed genuinely torn between her professional duty and the limitations of the system. The best I can do is administer an intravenous dose of antibiotics and an antipyretic to lower the fever, but I can't admit her. You could try a private hospital." "I don't have money for a private hospital," interrupted Nancy, tears of frustration burning in her eyes. "I just lost my job precisely for helping this girl." After receiving emergency treatment, which consisted of an intravenous dose of antibiotics and fever medication, Nancy was informed that there was nothing more they could do. With a heavy heart and Zoe partially sedated in her arms, she left the hospital to the sunny street, a cruel contrast to the emotional darkness she felt. The emergency treatment had given Zoe brief relief. Her breathing was less laborious and the fever had temporarily subsided, but they both knew it was just a temporary solution. The doctor had been clear. Without continuous treatment, the infection would return with full force. Nancy briefly considered trying another public hospital, but knew she would encounter the same overloaded situation. Gathering her last strength, she began the long walk back to her apartment, carrying the precious cargo in her arms as the sun began to set on the horizon. "We'll find a solution, Zoe, I promise you," Nancy murmured, although she wasn't sure how she would fulfill that promise. "I won't give up on you, even if I have to sell everything I own." Back at the apartment, Nancy settled Zoe in bed and observed with growing concern that the effect of the hospital medication was already diminishing. The girl's breathing was becoming difficult again, and small drops of sweat were beginning to form on her forehead, signaling the return of the fever. Nancy sat beside her, holding her small, hot hand between hers. The hours passed slowly, with Nancy desperately trying to remember anything that might help. Some home remedy from her childhood, someone who could lend money, any solution that would give Zoe a chance to survive. But her options seemed to exhaust one after another. Her family was distant, her friends were as poor as she was, and without a job, she couldn't get credit anywhere. As the night progressed, Zoe's condition visibly deteriorated. Her face was unrecognizable, swollen from fever, lips dry and cracked, and her skin with a worrying grayish tone. In her moments of consciousness, she mumbled more and more about her father and mother, calling for them in a low and constant cry that broke Nancy's heart. The words continued without forming complete sense. Politician daddy, singer mummy, big house with garden, fragments of a life that seemed so distant from the girl's current reality, lying on a simple bed in a modest apartment, fighting for each breath. "Nancy," called Zoe in a rare moment of lucidity, her voice no more than a whisper. "I'm scared. I want my daddy and mommy. Please don't leave me alone." The request hit Nancy like a dagger. She lay down beside Zoe, embracing her gently, as if she could transfer her own strength to the girl's fragile body. "I'm here, little one. I'm not going anywhere. We'll stay together until you get better, and then we'll find your family, I promise." The words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Nancy knew with a painful certainty that deepened with each difficult breath from Zoe, that they were losing the battle against pneumonia. Without adequate medical resources, without money, without external help, the options had run out. In the darkness of the night, with only the faint light of a lamp illuminating the small room, Nancy hugged Zoe even tighter, as if she could prevent life from escaping that fragile body by the strength of her arms alone. Silent tears ran down her face as she faced the terrible possibility that the girl who had entered her life just a few days ago, but who already occupied an enormous place in her heart, might not survive until morning. "How can I save you?" whispered Nancy, stroking Zoe's damp hair, who now breathed with visible effort, each breath a battle. "How can I save you when I have nothing to offer except my love?" The question hung in the air unanswered as the night inexorably advanced and Zoe's life hung by an increasingly thin thread. Dawn found Nancy sitting on the floor of the small room, her back against the wall, watching Zoe's chest rise and fall with visible effort. The girl had survived the night, but her condition remained critical. The medications purchased at the pharmacy and the emergency treatment from the public hospital had not been enough to combat the pneumonia that now dominated her fragile lungs. With the first rays of sun penetrating through the thin curtains, Nancy made a decision. She stood up with renewed determination and headed to the small wooden chest hidden at the back of her closet. There she kept the few valuable items she owned, a gold chain with a medallion that had belonged to her grandmother, a pair of pearl earrings her mother had worn on her wedding day, and a ring with a small blue stone that she had bought for herself after years of saving. They were her family heirlooms, her tangible memories, her emergency fund for the day she hoped would never come. And that day had arrived. With trembling hands, Nancy placed the jewelry in a small velvet pouch and looked one last time at her mother's portrait on the wall. "Forgive me, Mum," whispered Nancy, caressing the smiling face in the yellowed photograph. "I know how much these jewels meant to you, but a life is worth more than all the memories in the world. I'm sure you would do the same." After leaving Zoe in the care of Martin, her doctor neighbor, Nancy headed to the only pawn shop she knew, located on a busy street in the commercial center. The establishment had not yet opened, forcing her to wait on the sidewalk for almost an hour, each minute seeming like an eternity as she imagined Zoe's condition worsening. When the doors finally opened, Nancy hurried in, placing her precious jewelry on the glass counter. The appraiser, a middle-aged man with thick-framed glasses, examined each piece carefully, weighing them and verifying their authenticity. After what seemed like an eternity, he offered an amount that, although less than Nancy had hoped for, would be enough to guarantee Zoe's initial treatment at a private hospital. Nancy accepted without hesitation, carefully storing the money in her worn purse. As she left the store, she felt a mixture of relief and sadness. She had lost her last material connections to her past, but gained the chance to save a child's future. The way back home was traversed almost running, with Nancy mentally counting how much time they still had. Martin received her at the door with a grave expression, confirming her worst suspicions. Zoe was getting worse by the minute. "I need to take her to the private hospital right now," explained Nancy breathlessly, showing the envelope with money. "I got enough by selling my family jewels. Martin, do you think we can find a taxi quickly? Every second counts." Martin nodded, already picking up the phone. "I'll call a taxi immediately. While we wait, wrap Zoe in blankets. The fever is still high, but she's having chills. We need to keep her warm during transport." The private hospital stood imposingly on the horizon, a modern building of glass and steel that contrasted drastically with the simplicity of the neighborhood where Nancy lived. The taxi stopped at the main entrance, and Nancy hurried out, carrying Zoe wrapped in blankets. The reception was spacious and bright, with gleaming marble floors and wooden panels on the walls. A receptionist in an impeccable uniform greeted Nancy with a polite smile that quickly turned to concern upon seeing the girl's condition. The admission procedures were expedited when Nancy showed the envelope with money, explaining the gravity of the situation. In a matter of minutes, Zoe was taken to an emergency room, while Nancy filled out forms and answered questions about the girl's condition. When questioned about their relationship, she hesitated briefly before answering that she was the child's aunt, a small necessary lie to ensure treatment. The activity at the hospital was intense. Doctors and nurses moved efficiently, while equipment beeped and voices conversed in a professional tone. Zoe was quickly connected to monitors, received supplementary oxygen, and had blood samples collected for analysis. Nancy observed everything with a mixture of hope and apprehension, silently praying they had arrived in time. "We're doing everything we can for your niece," said the doctor, a man with a gentle but concerned expression. "The pneumonia is in an advanced stage, but we've started powerful intravenous antibiotics and respiratory therapy. The next few hours will be critical. Is there any way to contact her parents?" Nancy lowered her eyes, guilt weighing on her shoulders. "I still haven't been able to locate them. I found Zoe lost during the storm and have been taking care of her since then. She has talked about them in her delirium, but nothing concrete that would help me find them." While the doctors worked to stabilize Zoe, Nancy remained seated in the waiting room, physically and emotionally exhausted. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the occasional movement of nurses and the distant sound of medical equipment. It was during one of these long hours of waiting that a middle-aged nurse passed through the corridor, carrying a tray with medications. She cast a casual glance at the room where Zoe was being treated and stopped abruptly, as if she had seen a ghost. Approaching cautiously, the nurse observed the girl for a few moments, her gaze fixed on the handmade bracelet on the child's wrist. With an expression of growing certainty, she took a small folded newspaper from her uniform pocket and opened it to a specific page, where Zoe's photo smiled next to a man in a suit and an elegant woman. The headline was clear: Politician's daughter missing for days. The nurse looked again at the girl, comparing her face with the photograph, despite the difference caused by the illness. The handmade bracelet, however, was unmistakable, made of colored beads in a specific pattern, exactly like the one shown in an enlarged detail of the newspaper photo. "My God, it's her," muttered the nurse, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's Stephen's daughter, the one who disappeared during the school trip. How did I not realize it before? I need to contact the authorities immediately," Nancy observed, confused, when the nurse approached her with an intense expression, holding an open newspaper. "Mom, I think we've found the parents of the girl you brought in. This is Zoe, isn't it? The missing daughter of politician Stephen and his wife Elizabeth." The world seemed to freeze around Nancy. With trembling hands, she took the newspaper and observed the photograph. There was no doubt, even with her face swollen from fever, that was her Zoe, smiling next to her parents in an official photo. The puzzle pieces finally fit together. The politician daddy and singer mommy that Zoe mentioned in her delirium were real. Stephen, an influential rising politician whose face Nancy vaguely recognized from posters and news, and his wife Elizabeth, a former opera singer who had given up her career for political stages alongside her husband. The newspaper detailed how the girl had gotten lost during a school trip to the museum days before, triggering a frantic search throughout the city. Nancy felt a mixture of emotions: relief for finally knowing the identity of Zoe's family, happiness to know that the girl was intensely loved and sought after, and a strange emptiness upon realizing that her brief time as a caregiver was coming to an end. "Yes, it's her," Nancy confirmed, returning the newspaper with a sad smile. "Thank God we found her family. Please contact them immediately. Zoe needs her parents by her side now more than ever." The events that followed seemed to occur at an accelerated speed. The nurse contacted the authorities, who in turn informed Stephen and Elizabeth. In less than an hour, the hospital became the center of a small commotion. Police cars parked at the entrance, security guards positioned themselves strategically, and journalists began to gather nearby, alerted by informants about the possible location of the politician's daughter. Nancy observed everything with growing anxiety, suddenly feeling out of place in that environment of authority and power. When the couple finally arrived, their entrance was almost cinematic. Stephen, tall and imposing, even with his face marked by fatigue, and Elizabeth, elegant even in anguish, crossed the main hall escorted by security guards. Nancy recognized them immediately from the newspaper photos, but in person, their presence was even more impactful. There was an aura of authority around Stephen that made people naturally clear the way, while Elizabeth's face, even tense with worry, revealed a classic beauty that cameras couldn't fully capture. They were led directly to the room where Zoe was being treated, and Nancy remained at a distance, watching through the glass door the moment when the parents finally reunited with their daughter. Elizabeth rushed to the bed, carefully embracing the small figure connected to tubes and monitors, while Stephen remained momentarily paralyzed at the entrance, as if fearing that the image before him was an illusion that would vanish if he approached too quickly. "My daughter, my treasure," sobbed Elizabeth, covering Zoe's face with soft kisses. "We finally found you. We searched every corner, every street, every hospital. We never lost hope." Stephen, recovering from the initial shock, approached the bed and took Zoe's small hand in his. "Princess, Daddy is here now. You're safe. We'll take care of you, and soon you'll be strong again to play in the garden and read your favorite books." It was only after the first emotional moments with their daughter that Stephen and Elizabeth noticed Nancy standing discreetly in the hallway. The doctor responsible for Zoe's case approached the couple and briefly explained the situation. How that woman had brought the girl to the hospital, paying for the treatment with money they later discovered had come from selling her family jewels. Stephen and Elizabeth exchanged a meaningful look before Stephen left the room and approached Nancy. There was an intensity in his eyes that made Nancy instinctively step back, uncertain if she was about to receive gratitude or accusation. After all, she had kept Zoe for days without contacting the authorities, even though she was unaware of her identity. "You're Nancy?" asked Stephen, his voice surprisingly gentle despite his intimidating appearance. "The doctor told us you were the one who found our daughter and brought her here. My wife and I would very much like to understand how this happened." Nancy, nervous but determined to tell the truth, explained in detail how she had found Zoe during the storm, trying to take shelter in the mansion where she worked as a cook. She described how the girl was hungry and frightened, how she had offered food and shelter, and how her employer, Richard, had fired her for this act of kindness. She recounted the long hours caring for Zoe's growing fever, the visit to the public hospital that resulted only in emergency treatment, and finally her desperate decision to sell family jewels to ensure adequate care. Stephen listened attentively, his face alternating between expressions of gratitude, indignation, and admiration. When Nancy mentioned Richard's name, however, something in his expression changed. A shadow passed over his eyes, followed by a flash of recognition that didn't escape Nancy's perception. "Richard Montgomery?" questioned Stephen, his voice suddenly tense. "The real estate businessman? The one I'm finalizing a public infrastructure contract with?" Nancy nodded, surprised by the unexpected connection. "Yes, I worked as a cook in his mansion for 15 years, until the day before yesterday. I didn't know you knew each other." Stephen's countenance visibly hardened, his jaw contracting with contained anger. "I know him well. We've been negotiating a billion-dollar contract for months, a project that would transform part of the city and generate thousands of jobs. The final signing is scheduled for tomorrow." He paused, breathing deeply to control his growing indignation. "And you're telling me this man kicked my sick daughter out of his house? That he fired you for feeding a lost and hungry child?" As Stephen processed this information, Elizabeth left the room and joined the conversation. Nancy briefly repeated her story, watching Zoe's mother's face transform with each word. At the end of the account, Elizabeth, with tears in her eyes, unexpectedly embraced Nancy, a gesture so sincere and warm that it broke the last emotional barriers of the former cook. For a moment, the two women remained united by their shared love for Zoe, transcending differences in class and circumstance. The embrace ended when a nurse approached, informing them that Zoe had awakened and was asking for her friend Nancy. Hesitantly, Nancy looked at Elizabeth, who smiled encouragingly and gestured for her to enter the room. Stephen followed them, his expression still thoughtful after the recent revelations. "Nancy, you saved my daughter," said Elizabeth with a voice choked with emotion. "Please, come see her. She's asking for you, and after everything she's been through, she deserves to see a friendly and familiar face." Zoe looked fragile among the white hospital sheets, but her eyes lit up when she saw Nancy entering the room. The fever had decreased thanks to the intravenous medications, and although she was still clearly sick, there was a visible improvement in her condition. Oxygen tubes assisted her breathing, and monitors recorded her vital signs with rhythmic and comforting beeps. Nancy approached carefully, aware of Stephen and Elizabeth's gazes, suddenly feeling like an intruder in that family reunion. There was so much she would like to say to Zoe, but now in front of her parents, the words seemed inadequate, insufficient. However, it was Zoe who broke the silence, extending her small hand to Nancy with a weak but genuine smile. "Nancy, you came to see me," said the girl with a hoarse but cheerful voice. "Mom and Dad told me you took care of me all this time. You're my guardian angel, aren't you?" Nancy felt tears burning in her eyes as she gently held Zoe's hand. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to have this wonderful child in her life permanently, but quickly pushed the thought away. Zoe had loving parents, a family, a home, everything Nancy couldn't offer. Her role in the girl's life had been brief but crucial, a bridge between danger and safety. And now that this bridge had fulfilled its purpose, it was time to step away. With a lump in her throat, Nancy realized that this was the moment of farewell. "I came to say goodbye, little one," Nancy said softly, struggling to maintain composure. "Your parents are here now, and they will take very good care of you. I was so happy to help, even if for a short time." Zoe's face transformed into a mask of panic, her eyes widening with alarm. "Don't go away, Nancy. Please stay with me. You promised you wouldn't leave me alone." Nancy felt her heart breaking at hearing the desperation in the girl's voice. She looked helplessly at Stephen and Elizabeth, uncertain about how to proceed. To her surprise, it was Stephen who stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. His face, previously tense with anger directed at Richard, now displayed an expression of genuine gratitude and consideration. "Nancy, My wife and I talked briefly while you were with the doctors, Stephen began, his voice firm but gentle. What you did for our daughter. There are no words to express our gratitude. You sacrificed your job, sold your family jewelry, and dedicated every moment to caring for Zoe without even knowing her. Elizabeth approached, holding Nancy's free hand. We would like to offer something in return. We need a housekeeper in our home, someone trustworthy with a generous heart. The salary would be 3 times higher than what you received working for Richard. Nancy was momentarily speechless, unable to process the turnaround in her fortune. Just a few hours ago, she faced the prospect of unemployment, poverty, and possible eviction. Now she was being offered a position in one of the most privileged homes in the city, with a salary that would completely transform her financial reality. More importantly, it meant she could continue to be part of Zoe's life, watching her grow and flourish. The emotion was so overwhelming that Nancy couldn't contain the tears that now ran freely down her face. I don't know what to say, stammered Nancy, looking between Stephen, Elizabeth, and Zoe's hopeful face. It would be an honor to work for your family. Thank you for this unbelievable opportunity. Zoe clapped weakly, her joy visible despite her exhaustion. Nancy will live with us, Dad? Can she tell me stories every night like she did at her house? In the days that followed, Zoe's condition improved rapidly under intensive medical care and the constant love of both her parents and Nancy, who rarely left the hospital. When she was finally discharged, 5 days after being admitted, the little girl was almost completely recovered from pneumonia, although she still needed rest and special care at home. During this period, Stephen had discreetly investigated Richard's situation, confirming everything Nancy had told and discovering even more about the businessman's character through conversations with other employees and business partners. What he discovered only strengthened his determination to confront Richard directly, not just for how he had treated his daughter, but for a pattern of behavior that revealed a fundamental disregard for human dignity, especially of the less privileged. On the morning Zoe was discharged, while Nancy helped pack the girl's few belongings to leave the hospital, Stephen called his wife for a private conversation in the hallway. I want Richard to see with his own eyes who was the beggar he expelled from his house, explained Stephen, his voice low but loaded with determination. I need him to fully understand the magnitude of his mistake, and more importantly, to face the consequences of his cruelty. Elizabeth nodded, understanding her husband's intention. And Zoe? Do you think it's prudent to take her to this confrontation? Stephen ran his hand through his hair, considering carefully. Zoe is sufficiently recovered, and I guarantee she won't be in any stressful situation. I just want Richard to see her. There will be no confrontation in front of her, and Nancy will be with us the whole time. Days later, when Zoe was already comfortably settled in the Parkers' mansion, and Nancy had begun to adapt to her new position as housekeeper, Stephen announced his plan. The family's official limousine would take Stephen, Elizabeth, Zoe, and Nancy to Richard's mansion for an unexpected visit. The pretext would be to discuss the final conditions of the contract, but the true purpose was clear to all the adults involved. It was time for Richard to face the consequences of his actions. Zoe, innocent and excited about the outing, wore her favorite dress and brought along the book Nancy had given her during the days of recovery at home. The trip was calm, with Zoe chatting animatedly about all the plans she had for when she was completely recovered. Can we have a garden party when I can run again? Asked the girl, her eyes shining with anticipation. Nancy can make that chocolate cake she promised me, and we can invite my friends from school. Elizabeth smiled, stroking her daughter's hair. Of course, my love. As soon as the doctor says you're completely recovered, we'll have the biggest party this town has ever seen. When the imposing limousine stopped in front of Richard's mansion, it caused immediate commotion among the security guards and staff. No one expected the politician's visit, especially not to his private residence and without prior scheduling. The news of Stephen's arrival quickly reached Richard's ears, who was in his office nervously reviewing the contract documents he hoped to sign the next day. Upon being informed about the unexpected visitors, the businessman felt a mixture of anxiety and relief. Perhaps Stephen was coming personally to confirm that the agreement would proceed as planned. Richard hastily adjusted his tie, checked his appearance in the wall mirror, and headed to the main entrance to receive the important visitor with all the cordiality he could muster. Stephen, what a pleasant surprise, Richard began, forcing a smile as he opened the front door. The words died in his throat when he saw who was accompanying the politician. Next to Stephen was Elizabeth, elegant as always, and holding her hand was a small girl dressed in a beautiful blue dress, a girl whose face Richard instantly recognized despite the transformation. She was no longer the hungry child soaked by rain who had begged for shelter in his kitchen. Now she was clean, well-dressed, healthy, but unmistakably the same. And to complete the surreal picture, one step behind was Nancy, his ex-cook, now dressed in simple but elegant clothes that suggested a very different position than the one she had occupied in his house. Richard's world seemed to slow down and then spin violently. The implications of the scene before him hit him with overwhelming force. The beggar he had mercilessly expelled from his house, the child he had denied food and shelter, was the daughter of the politician on whom the future of his business depended. And Nancy, the employee he had fired for a simple act of compassion, was now clearly under the protection of the Parker family. "Richard," said Stephen, his voice calm but loaded with authority, "I'd like you to meet my daughter Zoe and our new housekeeper Nancy. I'm sure you've met before." The blood drained from Richard's face so quickly that he felt his vision darken at the edges. A strange buzzing filled his ears, and his legs lost the strength to support him. The last thing he saw before complete darkness was Zoe's curious face, tilting her head to observe him with innocent curiosity. "Look, Daddy," commented Zoe, pointing to Richard as he collapsed on the marble floor of his own entrance. "He was so surprised to see me that he fainted." Stephen contemplated Richard's fallen figure, his face an impassive mask that hid the storm of emotions behind it. The circle had been completed. Justice had arrived in a way that no court could provide. When Richard's security guards rushed to help their boss, Stephen made a discreet gesture for his family to return to the limousine. The meeting had served its purpose. Richard had finally understood who the girl he had rejected was, and this revelation had hit him harder than any words could express. "Let's go home," Stephen said softly, guiding Elizabeth, Zoe, and Nancy back to the vehicle. "We have a lot to talk about regarding the future." As the limousine moved away from Richard's mansion, Nancy looked out the window one last time at the place that had been her home and workplace for 15 years. She felt no anger or resentment, just a strange sense of closure. One door had closed, but another, much more promising one had opened. Beside her, Zoe rested her head on her shoulder, the warmth of the little one a constant reminder that sometimes life's greatest treasures come disguised in the most desperate situations. "What will happen to him now, Daddy?" asked Zoe, her voice sleepy after the excitement of the visit. Stephen exchanged a meaningful look with Elizabeth before answering. "That will depend on him, darling. Some people need to lose something important to discover what truly has value." Summer arrived with blue skies and radiant sunshine, transforming the Parker Mansion's garden into a paradise of colors and scents. Months had passed since the confrontation at Richard's door. On the perfectly maintained lawn, tables decorated with wildflowers and colorful ribbons were arranged in a semicircle, surrounding a small, improvised stage. Children ran freely among the adults, their laughter mixing with the soft sound of music playing through discreetly positioned speakers. It was Zoe's recovery party, a celebration not only of her restored health, but also of new beginnings. "Everything is perfect, Nancy," Elizabeth praised, admiring the floral arrangements and the charming decoration that the housekeeper had prepared. "You really have a talent for transforming simple details into something magical." Nancy smiled, adjusting the last ribbon on one of the center arrangements. In recent weeks, she had found not only financial stability, but also a genuine feeling of belonging. Stephen and Elizabeth treated her more like a friend than an employee. And Zoe. Zoe adored her, with the innocent devotion that only a child can offer. Life had completely changed, as if the universe had finally decided to reward her after so many years of hard work and silent sacrifices. "Mom, Nancy, look, my friends are here," exclaimed Zoe, running toward the gate where a group of girls her age arrived accompanied by their parents. Her yellow dress fluttered in the wind as she moved with the restored energy of a child who had overcome a serious illness. Stephen, observing the scene from the terrace, couldn't contain a smile. Seeing his daughter running freely through the garden, without any trace of the pneumonia that had almost taken her, was a daily gift he would never take for granted. Beside him, An aide waited patiently, with a folder of documents requiring his attention. Political life didn't stop, even on days of family celebration. "Mr. Stephen, the reports on the downtown infrastructure project," informed the aide, handing over the documents. "The newly contracted company has already begun preliminary works. Analysts predict job creation above what was initially expected." Stephen nodded, quickly leafing through the documents. The termination of contracts with Richard's companies had been both a moral and practical decision. After thorough investigation, a history of questionable practices, abusive treatment of employees and environmental irregularities was discovered that fully justified the change in business partners. The new contract, signed with a company of impeccable reputation, would not only ensure the project's completion with higher quality, but also with ethical and sustainable practices. "Social media is commenting on the dramatic fall in Montgomery Enterprises shares," continued the aide, showing a tablet with descending graphs. "The market reacted negatively after the loss of the government contract and revelations about precarious working conditions. In another part of the city, reality was drastically different from the festive atmosphere at the Parker mansion. In Richard's once imposing office, the empty spaces where hastily sold furniture and artwork had been displayed evidenced the vertiginous fall of his fortune. Sitting behind a simplified desk, the businessman contemplated the document in his hands, an official notification that his latest loan request to save his companies had been denied. With the cancellation of the government contract, investors had quickly lost confidence in his ventures, causing a mass exodus that dropped the value of his shares by more than 70% in less than 2 months. "Mr. Richard, the union representatives are here for the meeting about the mass layoffs," announced his new secretary, an inexperienced young woman hired after the departure of more qualified staff. Richard nodded distractedly, unable to fully focus on the present. His thoughts kept returning to that fateful moment at the door of his mansion, the instant when he saw Zoe alongside her parents and understood the magnitude of his mistake. It wasn't just the lost contract, nor even the rapidly evaporating fortune. It was the sudden clarity about the emptiness of his existence, the complete absence of genuine human connections after decades of cultivating only relationships based on interest and power. At Zoe's party, the most anticipated moment finally arrived. The girl climbed onto the small stage, holding Nancy's hand for moral support. Although normally extroverted, facing so many eyes still made her nervous. Stephen and Elizabeth watched proudly as she adjusted the microphone and took a deep breath, preparing to speak. "I want to thank everyone for coming to my party," Zoe began, her childish voice amplified for all the guests. "I'm very happy to be well again, but today isn't just my party. It's also a special day to thank the person who saved my life." Zoe turned to Nancy, her face lighting up with a radiant smile. "Nancy found me when I was lost and sick. She gave me food when I was hungry, gave me her bed when I needed to rest, and sold important things to take me to the hospital. She is my real guardian angel." Nancy's eyes filled with tears as the audience applauded. Elizabeth approached, placing a small velvet case in Zoe's hands. The girl opened it carefully and removed a delicate gold necklace with an angel-shaped medallion, identical to the one Nancy had sold to pay for the hospital treatment. "This is to replace what you sold because of me," said Zoe, extending the gift to Nancy. "Daddy found an identical one. Now you can have your memento back." In the silence of his emptied office, Richard contemplated a photograph in a simple frame, the only remaining decoration on his desk. It was an image of himself in childhood, alongside his mother, a simple woman who had worked as a domestic servant to support him alone after his father's premature death. For decades he had buried these memories, ashamed of his humble origins, building a persona of power and coldness that erased any trace of vulnerability. The irony didn't escape him. He, the son of a domestic servant, had treated Nancy with the same contempt that his mother had probably faced so many times. The phone rang, interrupting his reflections. It was his accountant, informing him that the sale of the mansion had been finalized for a value significantly below market, given the urgency of the transaction. Richard mechanically agreed to the final details, hanging up afterward. His gaze returned to the photograph, and for the first time in decades he allowed himself to cry, not for the lost fortune, but for the humanity he had abandoned along the way. At the party, while the children played and the adults chatted animatedly, Stephen stepped away for a moment, observing his family from a distance. Elizabeth was helping distribute slices of the cake that Nancy had prepared especially for the occasion, while Zoe, surrounded by friends, excitedly told the story of how she had gotten lost and been saved. The narrative, already modified by childish imagination, now had elements of a fairy tale, with Nancy transformed into a fairy godmother and the hospital into an enchanted castle. "Everything okay, dear?" asked Elizabeth, approaching with a plate of cake. Stephen smiled, embracing her by the shoulders. "Perfectly fine. Just thinking about how life sometimes teaches us lessons in unexpected ways." Richard lost everything by denying a simple act of kindness, while Nancy gained a family by offering the little she had. Thursday, in the late afternoon, as guests began to say goodbye, and the golden sunset light bathed the garden with warm light, Zoe asked Nancy to tell a story. Seated on the grass, forming a small circle, the last remaining children and some adults listened attentively, as Nancy narrated a fable about kindness, compassion, and the mysterious ways the universe balances human actions. "And so," Nancy concluded, "the man who denied a cup of water to the thirsty traveler found himself years later lost in the desert with nothing to drink, while the peasant who shared his last piece of bread with a hungry stranger discovered by chance a buried treasure in his modest field. For what we give to the world gives back to us, sometimes when we least expect it." Zoe, with the peculiar wisdom of children, added, "Like the rich man who lost everything because he wouldn't give me food. And you who gained a new family because you helped me?" Nancy smiled, stroking the girl's hair. "Exactly like that, little one. Exactly like that." Did you like Nancy and Zoe's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you right here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.